Good afternoon, and welcome to our first TCR dialogue of 2022. First of all, we would like to, there are several organizations that are having Founders Day this month, and we would like to wish a hearty and special Go Mob and Blue Phi to the gentlemen of Phi Beta Sigma Fraternity Incorporated today on our Founders Day. Today, we are joined to have a wonderful discussion. And before we begin our discussion, we also want to let you all know that currently several AME members are involved in a hunger strike for voting rights. You can find more information about that. It's been emailed up by the General Secretary. We've posted an article about that on the Christian Recorder Facebook page, and we will also do another email about that later on this week with further updates. Also, we would like to extend condolences to the family of our columnist, Dr. Michael Carson, who funeralized his wife on the last Friday, and also to the family of Bishop DeVoe, who, as we know, the funeral was held yesterday, Saturday, and the funeral in Washington, D.C. will be held on Tuesday. So please keep both those families in prayer. To introduce our special guest today, we have with us the President of the Council of Bishops, the 135th elected and consecrated Bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the presiding prelate of the 13th Episcopal District, and also known as affectionately as Auntie Bishop to our guest, the Right Reverend E. Ann Henning Byfield. Bishop Byfield, thanks for being with us today, and please tell us a little bit about our special guest and what we will be talking about. Bishop Byfield.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas, and to this listening audience. I am always delighted to talk about my family, my nieces and nephews, and I'm particularly excited to talk about Chris Henning. Chris Henning is the Bloom Professor of Law and the Director of Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she and her law students represent youth accused of delinquency in the Washington, D.C. area. She was previously the lead attorney for the juvenile unit of the D.C. Public Defender Services, and currently is the director of the Mid-Atlantic Juvenile Defender Center. She is the co-founder of many initiatives to combat racial and sexual injustices in the juvenile system. She trains all around the country and is recognized as one of the highest knowledgeable and experienced persons in that field. You name it. She's worked with the MacArthur Foundation, Juvenile Indigent Defense Action Network, and she has developed a 41-volume with them, a juvenile training immersion program. She is a native of Nashville, Tennessee, graduated from high school in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. That's not on her, that's not what she sent me, but and was the salutatorian and the valedictorian upon their graduation announced that she felt that Chris was actually the valedictorian. From those kinds of experiences, she graduated from Duke University with a BA and a JD from Yale Law School and an LLM from Georgetown Law. She's We're here because she has published a new book, The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth, and this program will examine that in depth. She has received numerous awards in her work for freedom and justice. I the one personal thing that I would say about Chris is that when she came to the Washington area and began to work with juvenile issues, her commitment then and her commitment now is to provide a place, a system where persons, particular African Americans and people of color, will have a place of fairness in the system. And I'm excited that she continues to do that and to give God praise for her life, her witness, and her experience. And so, Auntie Bishop is excited and proud of Chris Henning.
Thank you, Bishop Byfield. Attorney Hobbs, Professor Henning, we're looking forward to our discussion today.
Absolutely. Thank you so kindly, Dr. Thomas and Bishop Byfield. And welcome, Professor Hennings. And I will dispense with the formalities and henceforth call you Chris, because you gave me that permission when we were getting ready to come on. It's good to talk to you this Sunday. When we begin these shows, we always start off with giving a testimony to our faith. And so I will begin. I am Chuck Hobbs. I'm based out of Tallahassee, Florida. Over the course of the last 22 years, have practiced law and been a writer, based here primarily here in Tallahassee. I am a member of the Bethel AME Church. My pastor is Reverend Julius McAllister, and we are under the leadership of Bishop Frank Reed. And so with that, my very first question to you out the gate is, can you please describe for our audience what role your faith has played in sustaining you both in your professional and personal lives?
Thank you so much, Chuck. First, thank you to your Bishop Auntie, truly, for that introduction and just for being life and support to me. Thank you to John and you, Chuck, for having me on the show for this very important conversation. But to jump right in, I love that first question, because I think it is the absolute appropriate way to start any conversation about social justice, is to situate it in a question of faith. And faith is absolutely my central organizing principle. I think professionally, my very understanding of what social justice means originated from my faith walk. As a child, I really grew up understanding that the Black church was vital to the civil rights struggle as the meeting place for rallies, marches, strategy sessions, right? And that our leaders like Richard Allen, Martin Luther King Jr. were rooted in that Black church and in a faith construct. And so professionally, the work is hard, it's emotionally draining, and only by the grace of God and by God's omnipotence do we push forward in this work. So I give shout out to the 2nd District, to Metropolitan AME, and to all of the Black churches that remain deeply committed to social justice.
Absolutely. Now, you know, when you were being introduced by your auntie earlier, she ran down your very impressive resume. I believe Duke undergrad, Yale Law School, and also a Master of Laws from Georgetown. With that in mind, can you describe for our viewers what factors or who might have been instrumental in inspiring you to first attend college and then later to pursue a career in the law and teaching law?
Yeah, well, if you know anything about my Bishop Auntie Byfield, you know that I grew up in a family of preachers and teachers, truly. And so there was no question about college at all. It just wasn't an option. That's what you would do. And the only question was where. I think, honestly, the more interesting question for our conversation today was how I ended up in law school. And it was in my very first month in college, I had an apprenticeship at the local district attorney's office, the prosecutor's office. And I had on my very first day to meet the prosecutor in the juvenile courthouse. And I will never forget walking in that door, turning down the hallway and seeing a line of children shackled together by their arms and by their feet. And I just stopped dead in my tracks. I didn't realize that in contemporary America, we were still shackling children. And the only thing that kept running through my mind was Roots, right? Alex Haley's Roots, over and over again. And of course, the majority of those children in that line shackled together were Black and brown children. And it was truly at that moment that I knew I would go into the field of law. And so that's how I ended up. And that was sort of that very first spark around working with young people in particular.
No doubt about it. And Chris, what I can tell you is that, I did a lot of criminal defense over the last 20 some odd years, death penalty cases, you name it.
Yes.
And as tough as death penalty cases were to handle when I was still, very much actively practicing, one of the more difficult things, as you just alluded to, is watching youngsters being, paraded in and out of the courtroom in front of a judge and what have you, shackled head to toe. It is tough. And one of the things that really sticks with me to this very day, I will be 50 in May. And when I was about maybe 34, 35 years old, I had the opportunity to represent a young boy named Johnny Lee Morris right here in the Tallahassee, Florida area. And Johnny Lee, and it might have even been around 2003 or 2 to tell you the truth, but he was an 8-year-old who had been misbehaving in school. And unfortunately, as you see, and I know we'll talk about this afternoon across America, instead of how it was when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s, when you got sent to the principal's office, you might have gotten 3 licks, you might have gotten some type of in-school suspension, and your mom or dad might have come to the school and given you more than 3 licks, but no one was calling the police on you if you were talking back to the teacher. Absolutely. Or even if you got into a fight in school. They just were not sending you into the system. Well, Johnny Lee got picked up at 8 years old because he got into it with his teacher. She was trying to restrain him. He bit her, which was wrong, but they brought the sheriff's office out. They arrested Johnny Lee, and they threw that 8-year-old child into an adult holding facility because they could not reach the juvenile justice district office to have them send a van to pick him up. So an 8-year-old child was in an adult holding cell with about 20 other prisoners for about 6 or 7 hours until they finally got his mother on the phone to come and deal with it. And it was ridiculous. And we wound up suing, and it was a positive outcome. And ultimately, his life has turned out to be great. He graduated with honors from high school, followed in my and John Thomas's footsteps, went to Morehouse College, and graduated from honors from Morehouse as well. So with that, when you were just talking, and I'm going to hush here and let you talk even more, I get the feeling that when you see our children and you see them being mistreated like that, somebody has to step into the gap and do something. And so
absolutely.
And so with that, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, I know that you have done both the teaching component and the advocacy component. What would you consider to have been perhaps the toughest situation that you ever had to deal with, if you don't mind sharing that with our viewers?
Yeah, it's hard to think about. There's so many cases that I could talk about, in this work. I think it is very much what you described, this outrage that you have at the the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. And so, I think I could tell two different stories just to paint the range. One of them is a story about a client of mine named Andre. And Andre is a young man who was walking down the street in Washington, D.C. He was walking with a friend of his named, Johnny. We'll just call him Johnny. Okay. And police officers roll up next to him and ask him if he has heard any gunshots in the area. And, our client says no, and keeps on walking. The officers are still not satisfied. They ask them, well, show me your waistband so that I could see that you aren't carrying any weapons. And so Andre and his friends lift up their shirt and again, keep on walking. Officers still aren't satisfied and say to them, well, can we search you? At which point, the boys at this point, two Black boys walking down the street, police continuing to follow them, know they have no choice but to stop. The boys say yes. Four officers jump out of the car with guns at their waist, and begin to pat down my client. So I'm going to just do a full stop there, because what is so disturbing about that case on so many levels was, one, that it represented what Black children in Washington, D.C. and all across the country deal with, which is the implicit and explicit biases that any Black child walking down the street, especially Black boys, are carrying weapons, are engaged in criminal conduct. And what I think we don't realize, and I think really harkens from your story, is just how extraordinarily traumatic those experiences are for Black and brown children. I've had police officers say to me, well, it was just a few minutes, or it was just 60 seconds of a stop. We patted him down and we let him go on his way, not realizing the extraordinary damage that Black children face as a result of a 6-hour stay in an adult holding cell, the embarrassment, the psychological messaging to Black children that they are less than, the fact that we as a country believe in fundamental values of privacy, meaning that you and I should all be allowed, or to be quite frank with you, our white brothers and sisters are allowed to walk through their neighborhoods without the undue intrusion of police. And so I say that to you. I mean, I instead of giving you, and I have done serious cases like you have,
yes,
homicide cases, rape cases, that really the messaging that I want us to think about is the common everyday occurrence, and how the challenge, some of the toughest work that I do is getting our community, getting judges, getting prosecutors to understand that a young person's encounter with the police is not without consequence, and quite frankly, is with extraordinary consequence and trauma. And so I think that's some of the work that we have to do.
Absolutely. And, we're going to talk a little bit more during the course of this hour about your professorial duties,
Yeah.
and as well as, of course, looking forward to talking to you about your book that has been recently published. But before we leave the advocacy part of your distinguished career, let me ask you this. What types of issues or cases have given you the best satisfaction? We've talked about the difficulties of the practice, but when you go home and you're sitting there and you're relaxing after a Friday, you've worked hard all week and what have you, what kind of cases make you feel good, or even years later or months later, in terms of, okay, I like the result that happened here?
Yeah, and so this is another fascinating question, because the work for me is, to be quite frank, so not about me. It is so much about the young people that we serve. And so thinking about what clients, when do I feel satisfied? It's when I guess the best way to do it is to tell another story, right? And this is the story actually that I opened the book with, and is one of the reasons that I wrote this book. And it is about a client named Eric. And Eric is a client that I met after one Saturday night. Eric is watching television. And he sees someone making a Molotov cocktail on the television. He thinks it looks cool. He's 13 years old, and his 13-year-old brain, he says, let me see if I can make something that looks like that. He runs into the kitchen, he grabs a glass bottle, and he begins to pour liquid in that bottle, not paying attention to whether it's flammable or not flammable. He finds bleach, pine sol, whatever he can find. And then in his little 13-year-old brain, he takes a piece of toilet paper and runs it from the inside of the bottle to the outside of the bottle and closes it up. And he decides, this looks like, if I tape it up, this is going to look like my little Molotov cocktail. He's a kid. He forgets all about it. He puts it in his book bag so that it won't spill out on his mother's white carpet. And, Monday morning comes, his mother drives him to school, and he puts the book bag on the metal, the conveyor belt, and goes through the metal detector. The security guard sees that sees the bottle. She doesn't know what it is and says, what is it? He immediately says, oh, that is nothing. You can throw that away. And he goes on to class. Little does he know that was the beginning, Chuck, of a 9-month ordeal in DC Superior Court. He gets arrested. Let me just be clear. The fire department shows up. The police department shows up. They drag him out of class, embarrass him in front of his friends, and arrest him, charging him with attempted arson for an object that's not flammable. They charge him with possession of a Molotov cocktail. And so you ask me, what's the case that I'm most proud of? It is the fact that we persisted, that we did not give up, that this was the most absurd overreaching of the law. It was a teenager being a teenager being creative. And yet we have such a vicious narrative about Black children being dangerous and violent that we were so convinced that he literally said to them, I am not trying to blow up the school. No one gave him the benefit of the doubt. And so what happens with that case? We litigated it just nonstop. They kept coming back to us with plea offers. They were like, Professor Henning, you can choose whatever offer you want, whatever misdemeanor you want. We're not pleading to anything. This is absurd. So we litigated that. We hired expert witnesses to demonstrate that the liquid wasn't flammable. We had evidentiary hearings, and this literally lasted for 9 months, which wasn't great for the kid at all, because he got excluded from his programs and the like. But here's what's also, we really developed a very close relationship with him, the young man, and I actually don't even want to call him young man. He was a child. He was a boy, right? Yeah. We developed a very close mentor-mentee relationship with him, with his family. And now years later, I do want you all to read the book. You find out what happens to Eric at the end, but it's a good story. It's a good outcome. And it's a good outcome because he was a child who had the benefit of a family who loved him and supported him and stood by him. He succeeded because he had a legal team. And that's nothing about me, because the point I want to make here is about the funding and the access to legal advocacy, which so many children across our country do not have at all. So it's not about me, it's not about you, Chuck, as a lawyer, but it's about the ways in which the system doles out resources and legal advocacy for young people. So that was a story that I think and let me be clear, the way the story ended, well, part of the way, I won't tell the end of his story, but the way the story ended legally was we filed a motion to dismiss the case in the interest of justice and convinced our judge that this was normal adolescent behavior. Absolutely. And that our Black child was no more dangerous or threatening than any other child in the country. And so that was what was, I think, a valuable example of what you go home and can at least sleep with.
Absolutely. You are watching the TCR Dialogues with Chris Henning, attorney, author, and professor at Georgetown University Law Center. Stay tuned as we have to pay the bills with this advertising break.
Founded in 1852, the Christian Recorder is the United States' oldest periodical, continuously published by Black people and the official newspaper of the AME Church. We are your official source for AME news, featuring a diverse array of writers from around the world. Be sure to check out our TCR Dialogue series on YouTube. Paid subscriptions are $36 a year. Please subscribe or renew today. We need your support. Interested in multiple subscriptions? Call our office today to ask about our special bulk program for churches with complimentary advertising.
And welcome back to TCR Dialogues. I am your host, Chuck Hobbs, and I am having a discussion with Chris Henning, law professor, author, and attorney. When we left off, you were telling us a little bit about your book. We're going to delve more deeply into that as we go into the second part of the segment. But before we do, I have one question that we kind of talked about a little bit via email prior to today's show. And that is that, you and I both know, and we'll tell our viewers that about a decade or so ago, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty for juveniles, while in just the past year, limiting life without parole for juveniles convicted of murder only for those, quote, deemed so incorrigible that there is no hope for rehabilitation. In your professional opinion, that phrase, no hope for rehabilitation, that kind of sticks at me based upon the things that you were just talking about, adolescent behavior, child behavior, and even young adult behavior. Can you talk to me a little bit about what's your professional opinion about the ability or lack thereof of young people being able to turn the corner and change their ways?
Absolutely. And I hope in this faith-based community that is our audience that we can all agree that there is no child beyond redemption. And it really should not be a controversial point. But it often is, even in faith circles, but it should not be a controversial point. There is no child beyond redemption. Every child with the right support, the right opportunities, the right mentoring, the right mental health services, has an opportunity and an ability and a capacity to thrive. We know, Chuck, more than ever before than we did even just 5 years ago, 10 years ago. We know more than we ever did before about the adolescent brain and adolescent development. We also, and what we know about the adolescent brain is that it is resilient, right? It is amenable to change, to positive change. We also have evidence-based best practices indicating what works, even with the most serious and violent offender. And I really want to say that, especially in this, community. And so Chuck, I know you can relate to this as a defense attorney. When we talk about the redemption and rehabilitation of even violent offenders, sometimes the response we get back is, well, what about the victims? I care about the victims just as much as I do about the offender. And so the question for our faith-based community is, what is the humane response? What is the restorative response that serves the whole community as well as the victim, as well as the offender? And there is evidence of what works. And the most important thing that I really want to say in response to this is that this question about whether or not there is someone who's committed a crime who's beyond redemption is a question of race, because the evidence shows that we are more likely as a society to write people off when they have done something terrible, when they've had some terrible outcome, some criminal outcome. We write them off if they're Black or brown, right?
Yeah.
And yet we think about Kyle Rittenhouse, right? I mean, we can't, have this conversation without talking about Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old who ultimately takes the life of two people and brutally injures another. Right?
Yes.
Engaged in the most ridiculous, adolescent, thoughtless, I'm going to run out and, with my gun, my AR, my rifle strapped around my waist as if I have any skills, to defend the property and the businesses that he went out to defend. But yet that was the whole plea of, him and his mother and his lawyers, was to recognize the adolescence of him, that he made a mistake. And he gets off, right?
Yes.
And we don't do that for Black children and brown children. And so this question about whether or not anyone is beyond redemption has got to be the same for, all of my clients, my Black and brown clients, as it is for, for Kyle Rittenhouse. And I mean, I just have to draw the analogy, right, with Tamir Rice. So Tamir Rice doesn't even get a chance to be a child, right? At the age of child, he's shot down in seconds because, he is seen, with a play gun, with a toy gun. And then we see Kyle Rittenhouse walk down the street for hours, and then, he is seen as amenable to rehabilitation and redemption. So,
Chris, what's crazy about what you just said too is the idea that, and I have argued this as much as I can in my blogs as well as, on social media, that as Black people, watching Kyle Rittenhouse walk up and down those streets, just like you said, for hours, armed with the AR-15, we know that had that been us, that we would have been shot by law enforcement, wondering why we were out there at the riot with an AR-15, or at worst, beaten senseless and what have you, which again shows that no matter how much law we know or have practiced or any of that, at the end of the day, there is still a distinct difference in how the color of our skin has us treated as opposed to non-Blacks or Latinos here in the United States of America. And it's frustrating. It truly is. In fact, I can make you laugh a little bit. Over the Christmas holidays, I went to the Walmart to get an ice chest because I needed one of those big, huge ice chests, right? And so I go in there, and it's in the sporting goods section, and the kid in me noticed off to the left, I spied and saw that one of those old Daisy 880 Powerline BB guns, someone had removed one from a box, right? Wow. And so the little kid in me was like, whoa, that was my first BB gun way back in 1980, right? And so I walk over and look at it, and I'm like, wow, it looks just about the same as mine did 40-something years ago. Yeah. But guess what? I didn't pick it up. I didn't even begin to think about trying to, scope it and see. None of that. No. Because we know that as Black people, a security guard walking around might have thought that I was in there trying to rob the store.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, and it is. It's very, very, very frustrating.
And you know what I have to say, because this is, a conversation about adolescence. So you're an adult, 50-year-old adult like me, right?
Yes.
And you were able to do that rational calculus and that rational analysis. But, you think about a teenager, right? A teenager just being a teenager. What did you say? Ooh, this looks cool, right? You pick it up. Mm-hmm. And you don't do that's just natural, right? It's the natural, adolescent response is you pick it up and you play with it. And then you're like, ooh, I think mama said, don't play with that. But it's just, we don't have any room or grace for kids to be kids.
We don't. And with that, that's perfect time to segue into your book. And it's entitled for our audience, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Talk to us first about why did you write this book?
Yeah. So, I thank you so much for elevating this conversation. I think it's so critical. So The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. I wrote it because I have been representing children for 25 years in the nation's capital. And in that entire 25 years, I have only represented 4 white children, right? I feel like everybody needs to stop and reflect. 4 white children in 25, 26 years. So you would either think that Washington, D.C. has no white children, very few white children, or that white children don't commit crime. And I'm here to tell you that neither of those are true. And so for me, it is impossible to do this work for 26 years and to not be outraged and hurt, to be quite frank, as a professional, to not be devastated by that extraordinary racial disparity. And so I, a few years ago, just set out to really understand some critical questions. One, are these racial disparities evident all across the country? Yes, they are, at varying degrees of extremity, right? I wanted to know whether, what impact was this extraordinary racial disparity and this criminalization of Black youth having upon Black children? What's the impact, right? I wanted to know whether this extraordinary racial disparity was making our society any safer. In other words, getting all the Black kids off the streets makes us safer. No, it doesn't, right? So, it's just, so that's really, where this, for me, came from. It was also a really important for me to tell the stories of the young people that I had been representing. And you asked really, a really powerful question. What are those cases that are the hardest? What are the cases that you're most proud of? And one of the things for me was all along, I would have the cases that were what I call shock and awe. The cases that when I do this work, my eyes just go big. I can't believe I'm standing in court, defending this absurd, proposition. Or I can't believe that my client has been treated this way by a police officer. Or I can't believe that even though my kid did a crime, made a mistake, that he is being sentenced without any grace. And so I wanted to tell some of those stories so that the world would know, or our country could really grapple with and think about what some of the solutions were to this overcriminalization of Black and brown children.
Let me ask you this. This is not a new phenomenon per se,
Right.
but again, one of the things that I thought that was interesting in our earlier back and forth was, what impact from your perspective does the criminalization, which includes the hyper surveillance and or over policing of Black and, let's say, brown areas and youth, have on adolescent development?
Yeah. So look, we live in a country where America has had a long history of failing to see Black children as children, right?
Mm-hmm.
All the way back from the era of slavery, when the Black child was the purported, property of the slave owner, to, the civil rights era, when you have an Emmett Till, right,
Mm-hmm.
who can be killed or who can be sacrificed, so that white America, to be quite frank, can dictate that or make it plain that schools will not be integrated. And I talk about Emmett Till in conjunction with, Brown versus Board of Education, like, we're going to put you in your place and make a symbolic statement that we will not tolerate integration. So again, Black children sacrificed. And then we move into the 90s and we see that Black children are again sacrificed by politicians who see political gain from targeting Black children as the primary targets of the criminal justice system. And in other words, saying when there was a temporary uptick in crime in the 90s, they fashion a super predator myth that explicitly names Black children as the perpetrator. And so I say all of that to say that throughout history, we have, or our society, America, has demonized Black children for their own gain. Right.
Yes.
In some very, very intentional ways, for economic advantage, political advantage, to maintain segregation and the like. And in order to do so, you have to drive a narrative that Black children are thugs, brutes, Jezebels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Super predators, right? All of that language. And so today, and this is what's really important, Chuck, today, all of that intentional narrative is embedded in our psyche. And so that many of us who walk down the street, walk into a park, and we see a group of Black children, we're afraid of them.
Right.
Right? And we're afraid of them because of that myth that was first intentional, but now that lives on in our subconscious. And so that's really, really important. So what does it mean? You asked, the second part of that question was then, what is the impact? Look, we've got now generations of Black children who have grown up under the constant surveillance of police officers, and the effects are devastating and traumatic on every aspect of normal, healthy adolescent development. Look, we've got research, and I use the book to tell stories, but also to give readers some of this research on the impact in what I hope is very plain language, accessible way. But what the research shows is that Black children who have been the targets of police contact or who live in heavily policed neighborhoods report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, low self-esteem. The research shows that young people who live in these neighborhoods, even if they are not the direct target, even children who just hear about these kinds of police encounters live with the same kinds of fears and anxiety. So just having to wake up in the morning, Chuck, like you described, and say, if I play with a toy gun, I might get in trouble. Or if I walk down the street, like my client I told you about, Andre, if I walk down the street, then I'm going to be stopped. So just having to worry about being the target of police violence these days, right? Watching television these days and seeing, the Mike Browns and the Eric Garners and the Tamir Rice and, Adam Toledo's killed in the streets, so the evidence shows that it is really traumatic. Just the police presence, the over policing and hyper surveillance has an extraordinary impact on everything from sleep to identity development to adolescent play, which we take for granted. I always like to tell people about that. There's a section in the book where I talk about the value and the importance of leisure and recreation, right? For
Absolutely.
Young people. It's huge. We take it for granted. It's as important as eating and sleeping. But yet, through the criminalization, we deprive Black and brown children of that opportunity.
No doubt about it. Chris, just hold one moment. And for our viewers, if you can sit tight as well as we go to our second advertising break.
You can make one choice to improve your career in life. Would you do it? Of course you would. Edward Waters University now offers a new MBA degree program in a 100% online format designed so you can earn your degree while working full-time. Complete one of Florida's most affordable and highest quality online MBA degree programs in as little as 12 months. An Edward Waters University MBA degree can make you more effective in your current job or open the door for new opportunities. Go to ewc.edu/MBA to apply. Edward Waters University, emerging eminence.
And we are back with the TCR Dialogues. I'm your host, Chuck Hobbs, and I'm here with Professor Chris Henning. Chris, before we went on our break, you were talking at length about, some of the long-term impact, detrimental impact that the over-policing and surveillance of our particular neighborhoods have on young Black and young brown children. One of the things that stood out from your last answer was with regards to tying in the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, with Emmett Till being lynched as a 14-year-old in 1955. And, when we draw that back, and you already made you drew the line, but I want to highlight again something that we were talking about earlier. When you look at over the last decade, when George Zimmerman was placed on trial for murdering Trayvon Martin, how, the popular media narrative and definitely the defense narrative on behalf of Mr. Zimmerman was trying to paint Trayvon, who was about maybe 6'1". So he was tall, but he was very thinly built, maybe 170, 175 pounds at best. But they tried to make him into this huge brute, so to speak, that was such a menace that George Zimmerman had to kill him or else his life would have been in peril. And juxtapose that to what we just watched this past year with Kyle Rittenhouse, who
Absolutely.
was a large juvenile, both 17 years old, but Kyle Rittenhouse was a stocky kid, right? At least 215, 220 pounds and what have you. And yet everyone from the defense to even those within the popular media were trying to make him out to be this innocent Lamb of God, almost like, oh, well, yes, it's not right that he brought the gun, but he did. It was, and he had to defend himself. And it just made my mouth drop every time I would hear that, because I'm like, wow, where were these people defending Trayvon and his right to defend himself back in 2012? So
absolutely. And I just want to just put a quick pin there with Mike Brown, right? Because Mike Brown in Ferguson was absolutely described as a brute and large and a monster, raging. And then Trayvon, absolutely skinnier than Kyle Rittenhouse. And then the focus instead was on the clothing, right? Which was that hoodie, right? And I, literally in this book, I talk about, head wraps, hoodies, and hip hop, right? And the ways in which we criminalize Black adolescent fashion and culture, right? And demonize every single aspect of Blackness and Black adolescence. And so I just wanted to, hate to jump in there, but I just really wanted to.
No, it's fine. It's
all
fine.
of those pieces together.
Absolutely. That's why we call it the dialogues. We are having a great dialogue here on a very important subject. Now, I do want to ask you something else about your book, The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And we will drop the link again for the viewers so that you can purchase this book and even share it. You've got Valentine's Day coming up. We've got Black History Month coming up. You've got all kind of reasons to buy this book and share it and share the knowledge. But I want to know, where did the title, The Rage of Innocence, come from? What went into that?
Well, I'll spare you all the long story of how, of coming to a title. But let me say this to you about the title. It is this in my mind. The rage of innocence is the rage that every single one of us should have anytime any one child is deprived of the opportunity to be a child. Seriously, point blank, stop. Right? We should all be outraged by the ways in which Black children are not allowed to be children. But beyond that, there are a number of nuanced layers to that title, one of which is the rage, right? That every Black child, not every Black child, but that many Black children have when they are told over and over and over again that they are criminal, that they are not worthy, that they should be excluded. Imagine what that life must be like. And that's the rage that I talk about and that I am writing about. And so the last thing I'll say on this is think about Trayvon. Just going back to that, you gave that as an example. George Zimmerman was a civilian. Okay, he put on his neighborhood watch hat, but he was a civilian. And so I talk a bit about a bit in the book about policing by proxy. And that is when the criminalization and the hyper surveillance comes from your civilian brothers and sisters and not from law enforcement. And so that's just, it's the rage that we all have when we are excluded and demonized and criminalized for just being a normal adolescent.
Absolutely. And then one of the other things, last point with regards to your book, is that as an academic, you definitely could have written this in a treatise type form had you chosen, but you took it in a narrative form and what have you. What was the thinking behind how you decided to draft this book for public consumption?
Absolutely. You hit it on the nail. For public consumption. It is such an incredibly important topic. And I think, as we as a country begin to grapple with police reform and race relations and policing in this country, we've got to pay attention to the unique impact of policing on Black children. And the only way to get people to listen is to win hearts and minds. And we win hearts and minds through the narrative. My goal in writing this book was to get every single listener, every single reader to see themselves in those stories in that book. That was me when I was a kid. That's my kid. I see my kid doing that. And I would never want my kid to be treated that way. So my goal was to really, to change hearts and minds. And so it's narrative. And then for those folks who want to say that my stories are just one-offs or isolated, rogue police officers, no. I also provide you with the research and with the data in a way way that I hope is accessible for churches to read, for individuals to read. You know, Lord have mercy. I feel bad for the husband or the wife who gets this as a Valentine's Day gift, but okay.
You know, folks are woke these days, right? I mean, you know, it's a true love is being able to stay woke and understand what's going on out here about our people. So right. So thinking outside of the box here. So you're right. Well, let me ask you this, because we have so many followers here that are members of our faith, our denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. With that, what do you think that churches in general and or even community-based groups, I'm a Kappa, I believe that you're a Delta, based upon the discussion that I heard earlier today. With that in mind, what can our churches and organizations do to bring greater awareness to the issues that you address both in your professional life and within the text of your book?
Hear, hear. I am so glad you asked that question. That is why I am here today. We have got to take, on this issue. And I know many churches, again, shout out to all of the AME churches in particular and organizations that are doing work around police reform and criminal justice reform. What I, am asking is for us to pay special attention to the unique ways in which race, adolescence, policing, and the legal system intersect. Specifically thinking about what churches and Black organizations can do. Let me start with this one. That is to be the irrationally caring adult. I love this phrase, irrationally caring adult. Right? That means we know, any of you who has a teenager, who's worked with teenagers, you know that children will make mistakes, right? But we still love them and provide them guidance and redirection, right? We don't humiliate them, dehumanize them, criminalize them, incarcerate them, right? So what does it look like to be an irrationally caring church for our young people? It means meeting our teenagers where they are. It means insisting that our state and local legislative bodies endorse a public health and humane approach to public safety. And to criminal, I even hate to use the word criminal justice, but to criminal legal system. It means treating even folks who have done horrible things with dignity and humanity. So that's the first part of it. The second part of it is community awareness. I hope, to be quite frank, not for me selling books. I mean, it's not even about that, but it's about convening conversations that some churches will have book clubs, right? Shout out to Alfred Street Baptist. I got noticed that they've chosen this as their book of the month club.
Nice.
So, and a number of churches have said, we want to have this conversation. So that's one way. It's community education, because, we don't know what we don't know. We know that there's racial disparity, right? We know that there's police violence, but the extent of it, I learned. I've been representing children for 25, 26 years. And in writing the book, I learned so much. And listening to the voices of those kids. So it's about community awareness, community education. The third piece of it is legislative advocacy. Right?
Yes.
It's legislative advocacy. So again, shout out to all the churches, Metropolitan and other churches who get in front of their local and state legislative body and are pushing for reform in other areas, right? Let's push for reform also specifically around the juvenile legal system, radically reducing the presence of police officers in the lives of our Black and brown children, insisting upon developmentally appropriate policing. There's so many things that I could say, Chuck, that are in the book, at least, from the church level and the nonprofit organizations. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I'll add, Chris, is that, when we were doing these dialogues during the election season, during 2020, one of the things that I constantly harped upon and will continue to do now that we're heading into the midterm election season is everybody needs to know who their local prosecutor is.
That's right.
Who the district attorney is, who the state's attorney is, because, particularly within the juvenile system, it's the one part of the criminal system where if you've got a wise prosecutor or a wise judge, there's some leeway there on getting some good results. Whereas a lot of times, as in the adult system, mandatory minimums are so rigid that folks' hands are tied sometimes, depending upon what the crime is. So I just wanted to add that one piece.
Yeah, shout out to Carl Racine in Washington, D.C. He's our elected prosecutor in the District of Columbia currently, and he also has really taken the mantle and led the torch on reforming the juvenile legal system as well. So yes.
Excellent. Well, this is the last question I want to leave you with for today. I'm sure we'll have many more discussions in the months ahead. But one of the things that, we were talking about offline is the fact that President Joe Biden once was a public defender. Kamala Harris, we well know, our vice president, was a prosecutor. With that in mind, understanding that state and or in the District of Columbia, usually state laws and or district laws have, more sway on state court or district level decisions. Still, there are some things that the Justice Department potentially could do to help, ameliorate some of the conditions that you describe both in your book and that you and I have worked throughout our careers. What are some things you would like to see the president and the vice president do when it comes to juvenile justice reform, if any at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's largely a state and local issue that the churches need to push state and local legislators, but they also need to push the federal government. And here's the number one way in which the federal government impacts local and state juvenile legal systems, and that is through incentivized funding, right? So I want us to pause and think for a second that how many children today go to school, Black and brown children, that is, that go to school with police officers at the front door, right? So we have a rapid increase over the years in the presence of school resource officers. Why is that? It is because the federal government poured money into funding school or providing funds for states and school systems that would hire school police officers. We need to reverse that trend. That we need to use that same incentivized funding, right, to get state governments to increase mental health services for young people in schools, right? To have a public health alternative to police in schools. So that's one thing, is this incentivized funding. Incentivized funding can also end solitary confinement. It can end harsh punishments and incarceration of young people in favor of evidence-based community programs, right? Mentoring, vocational opportunities, counseling, improving housing, improving school system. These are the things that actually make us safer, not draconian legal legal responses, right? Law enforcement responses. We need the federal government to incentivize states to reduce disproportionate minority confinement. It's a fancy word. It just means basically, incentivize states to stop the racism, to stop basically, right?
Right.
To decriminalize Blackness. That's what I'm trying to get, what we need to do. And so there's a framework for pushing that. Demanding that our federal government collect data or incentivize the states or insist that the states collect data demonstrating that disproportionality. So there is quite a bit that can be done at the federal level. We need to reauthorize the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Acts, which is the federal law that codifies much of what we just talked about, that codifies the disproportionate, the efforts to address disproportionate minority confinement in the juvenile and criminal legal system. So there's quite a bit that can be done at every single stage, in the local churches themselves, engaging directly with young people, at the state and local level, and at the federal level. And I hope we all do this. I want to say one thing, Chuck, as we end here. I want us all to abandon, this is a pledge that I'm asking all of us to do, and that is to get rid of the word juvenile.
Okay.
And instead to say the word youth or children. And in part, not even in part, look, we did some research and we found that there was no other context in which the word juvenile is used except for negative context, like juvenile diabetes, a disease, or like juvenile male as in a horse, right? And then the juvenile legal system, right? And I'm telling you, the kids know the word juvenile is now the new word for thug. Right, given all the disproportionality. And so one of my missions in this country is to get us to stop using that word juvenile and instead really start talking about our kids as kids. And we're only going to see them, as children, as youth, if we adopt language, right, that affirms them and that doesn't dehumanize them. So that's one of my sort of final little takeaways here. Something easy we could do today and tomorrow.
That is definitely something that I will begin to work on. Now, it's going to be 20 plus years worth of programming to deprogram, but I think that it's worthy. I think you've made the argument quite well, Counselor. And with that, I have definitely enjoyed conversing with you this afternoon on these very serious topics. And I wish you well, both in your advocacy, in your professorial position, as well as with your book. And I do look forward to speaking with you again at some point in time in the future, right here on the TCR Dialogues.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you and all that you do.
Thank you so much. And on behalf of my editor, John Thomas, and Roderick Beelan, and everyone else who makes the TCR Dialogues what it is, I thank you all for participating this afternoon, and I wish you Godspeed in the week ahead.
Amen.